So as you were just notified, this webinar is being recorded, and I will share a little bit more about that momentarily. Let me pop up my slides. Alrighty, well, I expect a few more people to join us, but we are at noon, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you very much for joining, everyone. Your Hour with APA Virginia is generously sponsored by the Berkeley Group. Today, we will have Will Cockrell presenting, which I'm really happy about because Will is on our board as the CPAP chair. Will is a senior planner for EPR, and today we'll be presenting Unlocking the Power of Data, Strategies for Managing, Analyzing, and Communicating Data in the Planning Field. I will note that you will not see CM credits on this slide deck, but we are in the process of certifying those. There was just a little bit of a switch in our schedule. So there's a bit of a delay, but when we send out our communication and follow-up to all the attendees in the coming days, we will be sure to include all CM number information with you. We really do encourage questions, but please use the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box to ask any questions, just to help us keep track of all inquiries. But if you have any logistical questions or any other questions that may be not related directly to the content of the presentation, feel free to use the chat box. And you can also DM me if you have any logistical questions. You'll also have the opportunity during the Q&A portion to use the raise hand feature to request to be unmuted if you'd prefer to ask your question that way. But again, the Q&A box is the best way to go. I will share information in the chat box as we get started, which will include the link to our chapter YouTube page where this recording will be shared. I'd say no later than a week, and all of our other previous recordings, previously recorded webinars are there as well. And I'll also link some other pages, including our conference website and our chapter homepage. But otherwise, I will, at this point, I'll hand it over to Will, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm appreciative of everyone being here.
Great. All right. Well, hope you all are doing well on this Monday. I'm gonna get my screen up here. All right. As Jillian said, my name is Will Cockrell. I'm with EPRPC. We're in Charlottesville in Richmond, Virginia. We're a planning and engineering firm. And on the planning side, we do comprehensive plans, small area plans. Really, public engagement is a real focus of ours as we do go across the country on HUD and EPA and other contracts as we work with localities and help them identify and implement their goals. And so with this this afternoon, we're going to go over data collection, analysis, a few best practices here. For some of you, it might not be a ton of earth-shattering information, but I do feel like it's valuable to see it from a different angle or different lens. For some of you, this might be altogether new, in which case I'm happy to answer any questions here at the end as well. I also have my email address and information here on the back of this. So let's go ahead and jump into it because our window is pretty tight and we have a lot to cover here. So on our agenda, we're going to talk about the need for data, better data management and approaches, identifying different types of data. So there are a lot of different kind of ways of identifying data and to categorize them. So which data is it that you need at any given time? There are different strategies for collecting and pulling or creating that data. We'll talk about that briefly. A really important one, I think, is point number 3. There are different ways to analyze data. I'm going to talk about what I see most often in plans and what are some some areas for improvement I see in the field in terms of how people are collecting, analyzing, and presenting their data there. So we'll spend some time on that one. And then finally, we're going to get into some, what are some good strategies here on how to collect, manage, and present your data back out to your community, and really working with our local decision makers on, really helping them make the best decisions they can with the data that's available to them. So first off, let's take a step kind of to the side here and talk about the need for really taking time to think about how we collect data, how we analyze data, how we manage it and store it. Something that I've seen really over the past 20 years working in the field is, in a lot of plans, I keep seeing this kind of phenomena, I guess you could call it, of there'll be a demographic section or a data section in the plan, a chapter maybe. And there's a lot of data in there, but there might not be a ton of analysis. It's just a bunch of data is thrown into the plan. And the other thing I see is that that demographics chapter is really disconnected from everything else in the document. And I mean, really, any good policy making process, any decision making here, really ought to be built on top of good data and good analysis. And so make sure that when we go out there, that we're pulling the right data, the data that's accurate, but also that we're analyzing that data in a way that we're getting clear outcomes and that we're really tying that into the rest of the plan here. We have to also think about public engagement is data collection. And we don't really think of it that way, but we should. When we have our public meetings, our surveys, our public intercepts, and so forth, we have to treat that as data as well. So kind of two things here. One, I see there's a planning process. We hear what the community has to say, and then we just build the plan around what we heard from the community. I think we're missing something there because we still have our main data sets we need to pull in. And so we really need to take the public engagement, take our other data that we've collected and put them together and really have kind of a good understanding with all these things, all these data points together in order to craft good policy. So the other one here, I'll give an example when we get a little bit later on, but of incomplete data analysis, you will see that communities will throw in some historic trend analysis to show population over time and then make policy decisions off of that one and only analysis that they've done. Really, you need to triangulate your analysis and use different methods. We'll talk about those. And that's really going to give you a fuller, deeper understanding of what's going on in the community. And we'll spend some time on that. I think failure to plan for data collection and analysis in general, I see that so frequently. And I think just taking a little time on the front end to plan out your data and what it is you're going to do is going to help you be much more effective in your jobs. They say 1 hour of preparation saves 3 hours of execution. Same thing with the data collection side as well. So we're going to talk about kind of a data management plan and how should you kind of organize and guide your efforts here. And I think also with this of just the tendency is to just go out and grab a bunch of data from the US Census website, grab it, throw it in a folder, and then see what the data says. I'm going to make the argument that we should do kind of the flip of that and really define what are the questions we're trying to answer, what are our hypotheses, and what is it that we're trying to determine, and then go look for that data. Don't just do a big data dump into a folder and then kind of see what it says. You're not going to get the best results in your project doing that. And then finally is communication. That is such an important piece of the process that we leave out far too often. We have to keep in mind that in local government in particular, The planners, we don't necessarily have the decision-making authority. That's up to the local elected officials, typically. They have the legislative authority to make decisions on policies, on regulations like zoning ordinances, and on budgets like your CIP and operating budget and so forth. So really, it's about convincing those decision makers that the data that you've collected, that the conclusions you've come up with, that they're leading the decision makers in the right direction here. So part of this process we're going to talk about is also on that communications front. You can do everything right up to that point. You can collect the right data, you can analyze that data effectively, and write a great, kind of conclusions or policies for the elected officials. But then if you fail to communicate it effectively, all those previous steps are really kind of all for naught, unfortunately. So we'll hit on all those points. That's kind of the objective of this presentation here. Okay, so identifying the different types of data. I would make an argument here that kind of we tend to say data in a very general way, when in reality, kind of the types of data we're looking for, it really depends on what it is we're trying to answer in our process here. First off, we've got primary and secondary data. Biggest difference there is secondary data is data that someone else collected, like the US Census is a good example of that. That someone else collected, and they've gone out, they've retrieved that data, they've stored it, and you are going through and you're accessing that for your analysis. There are a lot of great secondary data sets out there, some of which you know about, some of which maybe you don't know about, but there's a lot of good data you can go out and grab that is accurate data. However, there might be some questions you need to answer out there where the secondary data doesn't exist, and that's where you're going to have to go with a primary data collection process. I would put public engagement here under primary data collection as an example, because the data doesn't just exist out there. You have to go out and collect it yourself. Another one of primary data collection would be field work. If you have to go out, take measurements as an example, that's another type of primary data collection. And of course, we have qualitative versus quantitative data. Quantitative, that's going to be your numbers, your hard kind of tangible data points out there. Qualitative is not numeric, and this is going to be kind of where public engagement lives many times. And so we'll talk a little bit about kind of where you're looking for qualitative data. Qualitative data is a lot harder to analyze. So once you go out and get it, typically what you have to do is rely on an exercise called coding, where you get the public feedback in and you have to code it. So you take each comment and you put it under categories like bike ped comments, economic development comments, and you code that out and then you analyze them individually. All right, so then we're gonna, again, I mentioned on the primary data collection side, I'm a big believer we could spend 5 hours talking about public engagement here. Instead, I'm just going to make a very brief mention here. When you are taking on a new comprehensive plan, a new small area plan, whatever it is you're doing in your planning process, again, if you take anything away from this, it's to take a moment on the front end and write out a plan for how you're going to, of what data you need and how you're gonna get that data out there. Part of that has to be your public engagement process. So what is it specifically you need from the community, and how exactly are you going to achieve that? This includes identifying what are the right tools for that data collection. So for instance, if you're trying to identify community needs or issues, surveys are great for that. If you're trying to develop goal statements, surveys are not good for that. They're inherently, that is not how you use surveys. But like small stakeholder groups is a great a great method for collecting or for creating goal statements. So as you're going through, you're picking out what is the right strategy to collect that information. I do recommend, again, I'm skimming over this, but we really could spend a lot of time talking about public engagement. But I really think it's important to have that public engagement plan. Write that plan at the beginning of the process. What are your engagement goals? What type of data are you trying to collect during your planning process? And your data needs are going to change as you move along through the process there. So really map that out ahead of time. Sorry to just skim over that so briefly, but again, that's such a huge topic there. Okay, that was just a mention. Okay, so other types of data. So as you're going out to determine your data needs, and as you're collecting that data, you have to think a little bit about what is it specifically you're trying to accomplish here. Again, there's a little nuance here. So there's a difference between detail when you're collecting information data out there. Detail being just a lot of data points in here. You're pulling in maybe with secondary data, a lot of census information coming in. Really, to develop kind of an understanding of the landscape in the community. So, for example, if you're working in a community here, all those kind of standard demographic tables that you might pull in, that's going to be a lot of numbers you pull in there. You can get a lot of detail. However, the depth is kind of the next layer that you might be looking for of what you call deep data. And deep data takes a little bit more analysis, and that's where the data starts to take on some sort of meaning. Kind of an example here of a public engagement process. We had a survey go out. There was a ton of comments coming in. We had something like 300 responses to that survey in a small community. We got a lot of detail, but we didn't necessarily really understand everything that we had coming in here. So it really took kind of next steps to really get that depth to understand the deep data, as an example here. In the survey with our detail, we learned that everyone in the community wanted a coffee shop, but we didn't really know why they wanted a coffee shop. We followed up with interviews to determine why, and that gave us the deep data of the reason they wanted the coffee shop is because they wanted a place to meet their friends and convene. They wanted a meeting place. So it was really those extra steps to give us that depth. Kind of reiterating a little bit of that information there. There is a different type of data you could collect here, and that would be something called more vividness. And this is something on the public engagement side. You can collect more through things like storytelling. I would call that data as well. It doesn't necessarily feel like data, but that would be more the qualitative side. But with vividness, it's really collecting stories and narratives and trying to pull out meaningful narratives and messages out of that engagement. So as I'm going through a public engagement process, I might initiate some sort of storytelling in that process to get them to talk about their community, their organization. And those stories are going to give us a couple of ideas. One is the stories you tell as an organization or community say a lot about what that group's culture is, because the stories you tell are reflective of your values. So you're going to get information here that you wouldn't normally get if you asked a survey. The other one is you can find a lot of really valuable points in here about what are important places, what are important events that have happened in the community, and to really map out the community in a comprehensive way. So I love storytelling. I like to try to fit that to process wherever we can on the more of the engagement side. And then finally, you want to try to get to a point with as you're collecting and analyzing data here to really get that nuance in there to really truly understand pure depth of that data, to be able to really understand the effects of the recommendations you're going to put out there, and also to to really understand that data and exactly what story that is telling. If you hear me saying story a lot, I think that's because I think storytelling is incredibly important of how we convey information just naturally as a species. Um, Storytelling was the way we conveyed information for millennia. And so when we're trying to uh, write these plans that we're working on as professionals, we have to keep in mind that we need to have that good, strong story in there as we're pulling those plans together. Okay. All right. So now we're gonna get kind of into the weeds here. I had mentioned before of in a lot of plans out there, I'll see a chapter, usually called demographics, where there's just a lot of numbers thrown into that chapter. And many times it's disconnected from the rest of the plan and isn't really informing anything else in that document. I do think there's a little structure here that could help you out if you're starting up on a plan and having some difficulty or you're feeling overwhelmed with how to convey or how to analyze that. And that's there's really four lenses you can use to analyze that data and really give you a fuller understanding of what is going on in your community. Doing just one of these is not going to give you the full picture. And I'll walk through a little bit of a scenario that I experienced in one county here in Virginia and just use that as an example. So if you're collecting that data, you're pulling it in, you have to figure out what it is we're going to do with that data. And really, you should be walking through these different steps here. There's historic change technique, there's comparative technique, there's compositional technique, and there's associational technique. So those are the four general types of analysis that you would be doing in your community. So first off, usually the first step that people go to is that historic change technique, where you're looking at changes over time and you can see what are the trends in the community in terms of population. Population's the most common one that people use, but you can look at unemployment, you can look at income, and really anything, any data points you can grab. You can turn it into some sort of historic analysis here. Typically, these are more short term. Occasionally, I'll flip through a comprehensive plan, and their historic trend piece will go back like the year 1900. That's a little far. You don't need to go quite that far back. I would say, depending on the data sets, 10, 20 years is just fine. You'd be able to look at those trends and identify generally where are these numbers going, and to give us an idea of maybe where these numbers might go into the future. You can in terms of tools to help you with this, Excel is an amazing tool that does so many different things. There is in Excel, if you go in there and look it up, there's a pretty good forecast function in there. If you create a table, you go click on the data, and there's a forecasting function in there. And that will give you some forecasts going out into the future based off of your line graph of your trend line over time. And it's a pretty good tool. It gives you kind of a general idea. If you also go into Excel and create kind of a line graph over time, so 2000, 2010, 2020, and make a little bit of a line graph there in Excel, you can right click on that line and it gives you a projection of those data points. And you can put in how far in the future you want that projection to go. So I'm sure all of you have Excel. There are some pretty good tools in there that are free for you that you have. So give that forecast tool a try, and then you can also click on the line on the graph to project those points forward. So just something to check out. The example here that I'll have is I was working with a rural county in Virginia. I won't give the name. I was working with a rural county in Virginia, and we looked at their historic trend over time and found that in this county, the population has stayed pretty flat over the past 20, 30 years or so. This community, once they looked at that data, their reaction was a bit somber, thinking that the community has stagnated, and they felt a lot of concern about that population growth or lack thereof over time. And their discussion started to really revolve around in terms of policy making. What policies can they employ to try to get the population moving again, to get some population growth coming in? That's a whole other discussion on how to do that, but we'll keep on topic here. So using just one of these lenses, they could look at that and have concern about their population, just looking at those trends over time. Almost always when you're collecting and analyzing data, you're going to want to have some sort of historic trend here. So you can see kind of what the numbers are doing, what direction are they headed in your community. And again, when you're doing this, just kind of a tip, most of you already know this, but make sure you use consistent intervals on those graphics, and also, you know, kind of a tip again, if you don't have to go back so far, you can kind of look at those past 10, 20 years, depending on the data sets. Okay, so you definitely want to make sure you have that historic trend in there. Another one that comes up is the comparative analysis. So I see a lot of plans out there where they have a bunch of numbers thrown into that chapter. They might have an historic trend over time. But then so what? If you aren't comparing your community with another community that's like yours, then you are going to be missing a lot of useful information here. So the key here is really finding a good peer community. So one that is about the same population size, has similar characteristics. If it's a state capital, picking another state capital, trying to find a place that has kind of similar politics or values. If you're doing something like a bike plan, then maybe similar topography, similar geography, and so forth. I've been in some communities where they'll try to compare themselves to cities that are much larger than they are. I think down in kind of Charlottesville, not to make fun of my home too much, but there was a lot of discussion years ago about comparing themselves to Portland as an example. But Portland is not a good comparison there. You want to find a community that is like yours. So if you're Charlottesville, maybe Chapel Hill or Blacksburg is a good example there. So you do kind of the same analysis for your community and your peer communities to understand over time, we're seeing some trends, but how are other communities like ours? How do we compare to them? And maybe there are some bigger trends or some bigger conditions that we're not aware of that are influencing our community. So as an example, to go back, working in that rural community here in Virginia, we did do the historic trend analysis. They were a little concerned because it was flat. And then we did a comparative analysis and compared them to other communities like theirs and found all those communities, their population had gone down. So suddenly you see how just adding one more technique in here gives you a fuller understanding. It started out as concern, our population has stagnated. Add one more to that, and suddenly they felt pretty positive about their community because all these other comparative kind of rural counties that were like theirs, their populations were also stagnant or even decreasing. Theirs was staying about stable. So you want to try to make that comparison, with your other peers out there, or even within your region. Okay, next up we have compositional. So we've got trends over time. We have comparing ourselves to like communities. And with compositional, you really take the whole population, the whole data set you're working with, and breaking that up into kind of smaller components here. An age pyramid might be a good example here. So that gives you, again, we talked about the nuance and depth. By adding these additional layers here, you're starting to get more of that depth and really starting to understand the data better. Now, in that example community I talked about earlier, we had historic trend analysis over time. We got that. We did a comparison. They started to kind of feel a little differently about, more positive about how their community was stacking up. But then we did a compositional analysis and really broke that down to try to understand, this is the total population, this is the trends, how it compares, but what is really going on inside that population here? And in that example, we found, this isn't the age pyramid for this community, but we found that their age pyramid was really an um, upside down pyramid. And kind of the age, the younger folks in the community that might be having kids were generally moving out, and the population was aging and getting older. And as people were retiring, they were moving into this community. So their population was staying stable, but it was staying stable because you had retirees moving in and kind of propping up that population. And of course, looking forward in time, we could determine that while the population is staying pretty stable, that might not be the case in 10, 20 years out. You're going to start seeing population decreases like what you saw in some of those other peer communities. So there was concern after the first, there was feeling more optimistic after the second. And then again here, now their concerns are starting to kind of shift a little bit more of, our community is really aging much faster than what it originally appeared. And how are we going to deal with those challenges moving forward? And then finally, it's really important to throw in there also that associational technique. And that's where you really take that data and break that up, start to make comparisons here. So in this case, we could take age and income, or race and income, or income and school performance as an example. Again, you get that deeper understanding, the deeper analysis, and that nuance here. And really doing this associational addition to your analysis. In the community I was talking about, they had concern about the aging community and how quickly it was aging. But also then we did this analysis of race and income and population changes by different groups in the community, and really found that there were folks in that community, there are cohorts that are really being left out, that were really struggling, and they weren't even aware of that. They weren't aware that certain neighborhoods or certain cohorts there were experiencing these disproportionate disadvantages. So at the beginning, when we had the first analysis, our policy recommendations might really focus entirely on business development, creating new jobs there, maybe some recommendations in terms of public revenues and so forth. But each time we added a new lens, we found that the policy objectives and the recommendations started to change as we were going along. So that is where I think it is critical. Please make sure that you're adding all of these layers of data analysis together. You really need to layer these one on top of the other. If you're just doing historic trend analysis, or you're just comparing yourself to other communities and nothing else, you are losing a huge piece of the story of your community. So I just really, if you can walk away with anything, is just making sure that you're really doing all of the layers of analysis here to truly get that depth and to get that nuance we're talking about. Okay, and then the other one is the presentation. So really presenting that data out to the decision makers. This is kind of another area where you really shouldn't be doing your data collection and analysis, and then later on near the end of the process, that's when the decision makers first see it. I see that so often where local staff will put a recommendation up to the board or council, and it'll get shot down, or it doesn't really survive the political aspects of planning that we all are aware of. But we have to keep in mind that communicating that information, that data, is is really that final essential cornerstone of the process. We need to have that in there and early and often throughout the process. I'm going to go through a slide in just a few minutes. I know I'm getting a little tight on time, which is why I'm talking so fast. But there is a decision-making stair step here of how do you convince decision makers to adopt a policy or a recommendation, and really making sure that the data is doing some of that work for you. When we get to that slide, we'll get to that soon. The other one is I want to make a quick distinction here. There's a huge difference between data and information. Data is just a bunch of numbers. It's really, if you just stop with the data, it's really useless. It doesn't do you much or any good at all. You have to analyze that data and turn that into information. And the information here is the really important piece. The information is what informs decision makers. So putting forth to the decision makers some big tables with loads of numbers in them is not going to speak to those decision makers. It's not going to really be of much help to your board of supervisors, to your planning commission, to your city council. And that's why we have to put that extra work into communicating that, converting those numbers into short talking points, into maps, into good graphics. There's no reason to not have good, engaging, effective graphics out there. There are too many tools out there these days that you can use. I'll mention a few of them. And just as you're developing your data collection process, communication has to be part of that conversation as you're pulling that together. So a good example of that, there's the Space Shuttle Challenger case study. This is famous in many ways, but it has become a really important case study in terms of ethics and as well as the importance of communication and leading up to the launch of the Challenger space shuttle in 1986. There were engineers that had all the information about the O-rings and why the shuttle was going to fail. The data that they presented is over here on the right. I realize this is a little bit grainy, but if it were clearer, it still wouldn't mean a whole lot to any of us here. The engineers were presenting this information to some of the decision makers who maybe didn't have, some of the decision makers who maybe didn't have, that weren't necessarily engineers in this process. And so here's some really technical information. They provided very technical, hard to read recommendations and analysis to them. And surprise, they made the wrong decision here. And so we have to make sure in planning, which is a technical field, there's loads of data and tons of analysis that goes into it. Really planning, we have to see more as a field that we are investigators and we're researchers and we're researching this data while we're also dealing with the political sides of planning and being able to communicate that information effectively. And when that's missing, that's when bad decisions are made. So great case study. I wish we could spend more time on it, but we do want to get down to strategies here. So we got a time check about 7 minutes left. And with all that said, as we're breezing through those slides, I do have a few strategies or recommendations for you as you're starting up a planning process. If you're just getting started on a comp plan, as an example, this might be a really good time to put forth some strategies and plans before you really get started here. So first up, I'd mentioned that the tendency is that when you start up that process, you're going to go to the census site, you're going to go out, just grab a bunch of data, you're going to throw it into a folder and just see what the data tells you. I would make the argument that it should be flipped around a little bit here. First off, try to outline your plan, your document, figure out what are the topics you're going to cover. A comp plan that could be pretty easy of just what are the chapters that you have in your comp plan. And then just how you're going to organize that plan and what are the topics or what are the main questions that you want to ask that you're trying to find in that planning process. So always starting there. What is it you're trying to accomplish here? Step 2 is make a real data plan. So you have the chapters, you know the topics you want to cover here. what are your primary research questions first? So some questions with land use might be, what are the population changes? What can we expect in the future? What does our unemployment look like? In terms of transportation, what is congestion looking like? And really first start with those questions. First off, what is it you're trying to learn? What is it you're trying to determine and figure out in your community before you really go out and start grabbing a bunch of data and pulling it in. This can also help you be a little bit more organized on how you're storing that data. So just setting up your folders so they're all organized by topic and theme and by questions, rather than just dumping all of it in one really big folder. Once you have your questions, I would recommend, this is what I do at least, lay your chapters out in an Excel spreadsheet. Under each chapter, lay out what are your main questions? What is it we're trying to determine? What's our thesis? What's our hypothesis under each one? Then determine what data do you need to answer those questions. So what is it specifically you're looking for? You can put in that table also, is this secondary data? Does the data already exist? Or are we going to have to go out and do some primary data collection to go and collect and create that data as we look forward? Oops, let me go back real quick. So I will say too of what are our questions? Make that Excel spreadsheet. What are the chapters? What are our main questions? What data do we need to answer those questions? I would add another one over here, another column on the side of where can we find that data? I think having this structure is helpful in many ways. One of them is that there's a lot of great data out there. But you might not necessarily be aware that it's there. So you got to start off first with what is it you're trying to accomplish here? And then you can go through and try to find those data sets. Does it exist? Who has that data? Who has the better data? Because sometimes you'll run into that too, of different agencies, different sources have better or worse data. Again, it's important to try to relabel ourselves as planners. We are researchers. That's part of our job. We have to research. We have to ask questions and go and find that data out there. So first step, what are our research questions? And then start to outline, internally in a working document, how are we going to collect the data? What type of methodology are we going to use? Of calling up people who've gone through that research before, getting their advice, making sure we're not reinventing the wheel. I can't tell you how many times I've done a big project data collection analysis and found out that plan already existed. So again, 1 hour of prep time saves 3 hours of execution, sometimes more. So really going through your research steps here. Anyway, step 3 here. So you have your document laid out and organized. You have what questions you're trying to answer by chapter. Step 3 here is to convert that data. So those are the 4 lenses of analysis, of using all of those lenses with each one of the topics that you have laid out in your plan. Again, if you just use one, that's not going to give you a full understanding of what's happening in your community. You're going to have a blind spot. And as a result, the recommendations, the policies you're going to put out there for decision makers are going to be off base because they're not going to be aligned with that data. Start with the data analysis information first, and then develop your recommendations off that. Next up is, the communication for it. I said that there's a lot of tools and that we go over that, and here we go. Excel can do almost anything. No one from Microsoft pays me, so I can say that, but Excel spreadsheets have so much power and we use them for such trivial things. But there's a forecast tool in there. You can use a projection tool in there. You can do really, I've seen huge models built off of that Excel. So if you're not super familiar with Excel spreadsheets, I recommend it is such a great tool to learn. There are a lot of good communication functions in there that you can use. If you don't use it, I love using Canva. If you have an Adobe suite in your office, they have basically the same thing called Adobe Express. These can take a lot of information and convert them into graphics for you. A lot of new functions here too. You can bring in a picture and say, create a presentation or create a flyer around this picture, and they'll use AI. They have a lot of new AI functions that they have in here that can convert and create documents and analysis sheets, infographics for you based off of a picture. So it's really useful tool. I didn't put it in here, but if you have GIS, ArcGIS, if you have the online business analyst function in there, business analyst, you select a geography, and it will create dozens and dozens of profiles for you with interactive infographics that you can use. Really good tool. We use it all the time. It's an extension you have to pay for, so just be aware of that. I think another thing I like to in the planning process also create kind of a hazard mitigation plan for the planning process. What could go wrong? How could people interpret the data in kind of unexpected ways? And really, as you're telling that story, as you're pulling the data together and you're analyzing it, of thinking through how could others misinterpret and misunderstand this data. Write it down how that could happen, and how are you going to prevent those misunderstandings from happening. I did say, okay, second to the last slide, I'm going to wrap up in just under a minute. What I found many times is in a planning process, you see a lot of great planners out there with great data collection, analysis. They might even communicate it really well, but they don't necessarily use the right sequence here. One of the reasons why comprehensive plans take so long and why planning processes really ought to take a long time is that throwing a bunch of recommendations and a plan into the elected officials' lap and expecting them to adopt it is going to really be a frustrating experience for a lot of folks out there. You see it a lot where folks will just put their recommendations out there to the decision makers, and they haven't really taken the appropriate steps before they got to that point. So there's a 5-step process on how to really present out there your recommendations, your policies, of trying to convince those elected officials that all this data and the analysis is the right direction. First off, you want to bring up that awareness. The data can do that for you. Let's say you want to present a affordable housing policy in your comp plan. You first have to show the decision makers why there's an issue. Why is there a problem currently? The data is going to do that for you. So really get that information out there first. What are the issues? Don't put the recommendations out there quite yet. Just put the data, put the report out there. Make sure that the local decision makers are aware of the problem, of the issues. Then you keep presenting that information. Really handy, great reports. I mentioned some of the tools, Canva, Adobe Express, a few others. Really have some good infographics. Continue to build that understanding, that depth, that nuance with the decision makers, where they start to really understand the problems that your data has revealed. Keep going through that process. It's a patient process to the point where there's concern. The local decision makers are now concerned about it because they really understand it and they see why this really is an issue, to the point where they're dissatisfied. Example, affordable housing, where they see how much of a challenge this is in their community. And then that is when you put forth your recommendations. So much too often people just throw the recommendations out there and expect it to get approved. But a good process is one that takes time, that you slowly unfold and help get everyone on the same page. So finally, kind of that data collection analysis part, that's early in the process. As mentioned in that last slide, it's a slow process to kind of bring the decision makers along with you as your research is revealing these concerns. That's why data collection is early in that planning process. That's going to really help you with every single phase as you move along the way. Make sure to use those 4 different types of analysis. Make sure to make a plan for your data. Make sure that you organize your plan early on and really define what are the questions you're trying to ask. what data is it that you need to answer those questions? And then you figure out where to find that data and whether you need to create some of that data yourself. So I'm kind of flipping that script around a little bit. We're not just going to go out and just grab as much data as we can, really think through it methodically, a strategic view on that. Sorry for the breeze through. We could I have a whole semester adjunct teach at UVA as well, where we cover this, and I try to smash a semester down into 45 minutes. So, but here's my information if you have any questions, want to chat, or if you have any additional detail there, I'm happy to catch up. And with that said, Jillian, I'm gonna pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Will. And again, attendees, we really do encourage questions. So please throw those in the chat or in the Q&A feature. I apologize. Will, I have a question for you to get us going in the Q&A. So you were speaking about, communicate or having to communicate data to a board, for example, and that data and information are not necessarily the same. Can you speak? Obviously, you're not obliged to share any specific details, but could you share maybe an example of a successful story versus a not a non-successful story in making those selling points?
Yeah, sure. I think I've kind of been really careful about not using specific community names. But I can talk in general terms of we were working on a small area plan in one of our cities here. And really, I think in that process, earlier on in my career didn't do as good of a job of really laying out a process early on as we were, getting started. In that one, we did throw out just a bunch of data to the local council and to the community as well. And there's so much data there. It was overwhelming that the process kind of stalled and kind of died on us. We lost a lot. I lost a lot of feedback, a lot of engagement from the community because we just threw a bunch of tables out there and noticed that folks just kind of got disinterested and didn't know what any of it meant and kind of felt like their involvement felt like a little bit of a waste of time, I think. We're doing another small area plan kind of in the Shenandoah Valley area. And with that one, we just really took our time with the community, with the decision makers. With that one, again, kind of followed more of this approach. And we were able to present that information out to folks, show, kind of build those steps as we go forward. Here are some of the issues and problems that we found in the community. We're continuing to present that in new and better ways with each step. And the community and the local decision makers really all ended up on the same page at the end there. Everyone understood. It might not have been super popular what the final recommendations were because the recommendations were really expensive, but we got that consensus at the end because everyone understood where that recommendation came from. They understood the issues. They had that nuance and depth there. So we were able to get a plan through with total community support. They were really rowdy and happy at the public meeting when it got adopted. And it's all about taking that slow unfolding of presenting that data and bringing everyone along with you.
Thank you, Will. And I will just say, we're getting a lot of feedback in the chat box, people praising the presentation. So I just wanted to share that.
Thanks.
I will say, while any other questions may come in, I will just note that in the coming days, we will be sharing the follow-up. We will be sending out, a follow-up email to all attendees. And as I mentioned, the link to the recording will be included in that, along with the slide deck and Will's contact information. So I know that Will's very much open to continuing these conversations offline. If you think of any questions
Yeah.
after the presentation today. I do see that a question just came in from
Mhm.
an anonymous attendee who says they're encouraged. I've tried many of your suggestions. So when faced with a community that doesn't trust the government and the data
Gosh.
collected,
Yeah.
communicating the data trends was difficult. Any further recommendations?
Oh, I feel your pain on that one. We've worked with so many neighborhoods where communities where the residents didn't trust the locality or government in general, or um, I think in these situations, what I found is building relationships with the community is essential. If the community isn't engaging because they're just not interested in being involved, they might have been burned in the past. There could be possibly some trauma in the community of just being forgotten and neglected for a long time. I would really make the argument, just find just someone, just one person in that community who's part of the community who will listen and who you can get involved in that process. Uh, we were doing one plan, small area plan. There was a history of discrimination or kind of neglect in this particular neighborhood. We started out with really nobody, and we got one person involved. They brought in some their neighbors. They brought in a few more friends. We just slowly started to build that trust, and that was so important. We thank them for allowing us and their community. And after building that trust, taking a lot of time doing that, finally everyone got on board. By the end, we had dozens and dozens of people attending every single call and really involved in it. And so relationships are so important. If the trust isn't there, that's a huge hurdle. And that with a hurdle like that, that takes time. It takes time and patience and really building those relationships and building that trust. Because you're right, if you don't have the trust, then the process isn't going to go anywhere. Following through, listening, and really building those relationships.
Thanks, Will. And there's another question from another anonymous attendee. Are there any best practices for updating data along the way? For example, if you initially collect the
Yeah,
data in 2021 and then a comp plan or other process is still going on a few years later.
yeah. Awesome question. I love that question. So, yes, and I neglected to bring that up. Again, I would recommend if you're starting a process up to make a spreadsheet. Here are your chapters, are the questions we talked about. What data do we need? Who has that data? But I think in there as well is putting dates on that. And you're totally right. A great point of that planning process can take a long time. I'm working on one that's on year 4, and the data reports that we did on year 1, that data is now out of date, and we're, having to go back. So I would make a good recommendation there of have a table, inventory your data, and put dates on it. Maybe even your file names, put those dates on there. And kind of check in on that data plan as you're going along. If your process is getting pretty long there and you're um, getting into the years on that process, check back in, look at those that data you've collected earlier. Is it up for renewal? Can you pull some new data sets in there? But really make a plan, an inventory for your data, not just throw it all into a folder like we all do sometimes, but categorize it, put those dates on it, and manage it. Where did it come from? A good spreadsheet can accomplish a lot there.
Okay, and we have another question from the chat. There's an attendee who's asking, do you have an example of a graphic that effectively communicates what secondary data is available and what needs to be generated and by which method?
I'm off network right now, so I don't have one I can pull up, unfortunately. Um, in terms of like graphic, I don't think I have like a good like graphic on what data and where is it. In terms of kind of what I use internally, it's just that spreadsheet. It's kind of an important one. If you aren't on Canva or Adobe Express, you can kind of check those out too. If you're looking for some good graphics on communicating out, there's loads of good templates, which is another great kind of great aspect of those tools.
Okay, well, it looks like we don't have any other questions at the moment, but as I mentioned, I will be sharing Will's contact information in the follow-up email to all attendees if you think of any questions after we log off today. But again, Will, I've never received so many positive comments to a presentation in the chat before, so
Oh, great.
thank you very much for your time and for answering everyone's questions. And thank you everyone for engaging.
Yeah, thank you all. And try to throw maybe a little too much out there. I'm happy to catch up if you have any questions. We kind of breezed through a few things, but it's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.